We have had a little bit of a tech problem that we've just gotten straightened out. We did not have the correct links for this session, but it looks like we have them now and we're ready to roll. So thank you very much for joining us today. My name is Melissa Johnson. I'm an Associate Vice President and Associate Dean in the Office of Undergraduate Education. And I am delighted today to introduce you all to Bob McKinnon, who is a alumnus of Penn State and is a author and podcaster and writer and designer. He's a children's author and teacher. And he is going to talk to us today about his experience as a teacher and also as a first-generation college student, low-income first-generation college student. We are recording today, and if you need the closed captioning, you can enable that at the bottom of the screen. We will have some time for questions at the end. And those questions should be posted in the Whova app in the Q&A, and we will answer them from there. And that way they are preserved for 3 months in Whova, along with the recording of this session, so that folks who were not able to make this session can go back and view it, and they will also be able to see the questions if we contain them all in the Whova app. So if you could just ask your questions there, we would appreciate it. Everyone's microphones and cameras are turned off today because we are in a webinar format, but you can communicate with me and with Bob through the Whova app and the Q&A and chat features, as I just said. And we will go ahead and get started, and I will be keeping an eye on your questions and let Bob know what they are as we move forward. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thanks, all. Before I get going, I just wanted to call attention to this. A couple of things in the chat where people are still having some problem getting in. One person said they had to close out of the app and re-enter to get to the session, and another person says that it's still taking them to the Village Talk. So I don't know if there's some instructions to tell people to leave and then come back. That would be helpful in that other session if they need to. But for those of you who are here today, thank you so much for joining. It's a pleasure to be here. As was just mentioned, I'm coming from this talk wearing several different hats as a first-generation student myself at Penn State. I have that experience, and most recently, for the last almost 10 years, I've been teaching at various colleges here in New York, both at the Parsons School of Design and at City College, where in that situation, 75% of their students are first-gen students. So I'd like to just start with a simple sort of request of you. Oops, sorry about that. Which is just to tell me how you're feeling. So if you could, in the chat, with just one word, tell me how you're feeling right now, that would be great. And the only rule is that I ask that you don't repeat any word that someone else has used. Emily, you're overwhelmed. I'm sorry to hear that. Some relief about the session starting. That also makes sense. Drained. That is unfortunate. I hope that's drained in a good way. Although I can appreciate that as well, having just come back from spring break with my kids and sort of feeling a little overwhelmed by the stack of things to do. Glad to hear that Denise is grateful, as am I. If you're wondering, oh, sorry about your frustration, Karen. I feel you on that, especially with anything tech related. It can often be something that's pretty maddening. I'm asking this question because it's actually the way in which I start every class I teach. And it's inspired for a couple of reasons. The visual you see right here is a graphic from the visual artist Jonathan Harris, who like 15 years ago, before the most recent wave of AI, had created an algorithm where he could see how the internet was feeling. So basically, he scraped data that said where anyone had expressed the sentiment, I feel something. And then he was able to analyze it in terms of how people were feeling in different places and according to their gender or their age at different times and things that were going on in the world. And then people were able to also add comments as to why they were feeling the way they were. So you would see spikes, for example, in Happy Valley when Penn State was winning, and you'd see spikes of people being frustrated when they weren't. And this was a really interesting way to sort of just take the temperature and the pulse of what was happening. And when I began teaching, this was not something that I did or practiced with great regularity. But then COVID hit and we moved to Zoom. And it was important for me to sort of just check in and see how everyone was doing, given how challenging it was. And at that time, I was teaching two different courses. One was at Parsons, which student body is generally pretty affluent, but a lot of people who are coming from different countries. And so time zones were a real challenge. And then, as I mentioned before, at City College, where most of the students are lower income, first gen, often in situations where they're living with multiple generations in the house. And it was a real challenge. And you wanted to see faces, and sometimes they couldn't come on screen because they were taking class from the bathroom, which was the one place for privacy. But it was an opportunity to really sort of just check in and see how everyone was doing and how we were showing up. And as we think about sort of this idea of our lived experience and how varied it is, sometimes as a member of faculty, you show up and you've got your agenda and what you want to cover for that day, and you've got material, but you may not know how the 20, 30, 50, 100, 200 people sitting in front of you are showing up at that moment. And so this check-in is really important. I added another element more recently, which takes us back to kindergarten, which will sound very strange, and some people may suggest that it's maybe not a great use of classroom time. But I now ask them to first say what their name is, tell us how they're feeling, and then the rest of the student body who's there will then greet them. So I would say, hi, Bob, today I'm feeling a little, overwhelmed. I might ask why they were overwhelmed, and then everyone would say, hi, Bob. And why do I do this? Well, this report from Yale suggests that obviously there's advantages to sort of knowing the names of your students, both as faculty and for fellow classmates. And I was surprised that even in small classroom settings where you didn't have more than 15 or 25 students in a class, I would often ask them how often someone would go through a year or a semester and not know the name of a single classmate or more than two. And it was remarkable how frequently that had occurred. People just didn't know each other. And we also know from other studies that depending upon, a faculty's appreciation, understanding of a name and how to pronounce it affects how often we'll call on that student for fear of not getting their name correct. And so the idea of being in a situation where everybody knows their name, where everyone can call on each other, is an important way to sort of level set and make people feel comfortable in the classroom so that we're all showing up on even footing, knowing who people are, what their names are, how they're doing each and every day. And it was an important early lesson, one that I continue, and one that actually students consistently sort of comment in terms of being a valuable way to know that they're being seen and heard and appreciated. Now, the reason why this is also important for me personally, what you see here is a spread from an upcoming children's book that I've written called America's Dreaming. And the first thing to point out there is the first line: have you ever felt all alone in a crowd? Now, this story is one which talks about the experience, or it's based on the experience that I had had when I had moved from Boston, Massachusetts to rural Pennsylvania. I was moving from one type of poverty to another, urban to rural. And I didn't look or sound like the other kids, even though everyone was white, but I had this thick Boston accent. And, I sometimes joke that I went from a place where, the letter R doesn't exist to where every word has a few of them. And so I sounded different. I looked different in terms of my clothes, and I was teased and made fun of. And this is not a universal or sort of unique experience. Every year, 5 million students start a new school for the first time at various grade levels, often feeling uncomfortable or alone, or maybe that they don't belong. In this story, the character's name America because, welcoming people, having them feel welcome, I think is part of what when we're at our best, do as a country. It's emblazoned on the Statue of Liberty, but we don't always live up to those ideals. And so in this picture book, America is a character that you never see. The whole story is shown from their perspective. And that's because this feeling of being alone in a crowd is one that we can all feel that we could potentially relate to in uncomfortable situations. And certainly if you're a first-gen student, if you're someone who is, low in resources, this is obviously exacerbated. I tell the story about my own experience, not just in this presentation, but in every classroom I step into. This is me as a kid, in addition to a lot of other things I had going on, including a pretty pronounced cowlick, which in hindsight, I dearly miss. I was also a little overweight. I had some other issues that were going on. It was a real challenge. And, I share my own personal experience because I believe there's an opportunity for us to lead with vulnerability, to allow students to see us as more than their professor or person of authority or potentially in power, but as someone who at some point was just like them, showing up in a classroom, maybe not feeling like they fit in, and being in a situation where I can share some of my own story and challenges, can sort of level the playing field a little bit and build a bit of trust, which I think is really critical when trying to get students who maybe don't feel comfortable in a classroom experience or don't feel comfortable sharing the fullness of their lived experience to just feel a little bit more comfortable. Now, I found this quote the other way. It's certainly was probably the way in which I maybe thought and acted when I first got into the classroom. I'm never wrong, just different levels of right. There was this sort of sense of authority, of knowing, and I wanted to acknowledge my own biases and judgment that I would often bring into a classroom setting. The kinds of things that you're there, you're ready to teach, you're ready to hopefully make a difference in the lives of these students, but there are things that sometimes happen that may frustrate you as a faculty member, or feel as if that students aren't showing up in the way that you want to. And time again, my students have taught me that the need to sort of check the judgments I make and the biases are critical at all times. So if you can see this graphic, this is a map of the New York City subway system. And if you look at the upper left-hand corner of that into the Bronx, not quite the last stop, but getting up towards that, the Bronx and Upper Manhattan and whatnot. That is where City College is. That's where I teach on Monday evenings. And if you look at the rest of the map, that is often where our students are coming from. And so several weeks ago, I had an experience where I was so frustrated by the fact that, our class was scheduled to start at 3:30, students, at 3:35, maybe we had half of the kids in attendance. And I thought I would sort of make a statement. And I would say, if you're in this classroom right now, remember that you're in the classroom. And when I ask you to stand up, please stand up. And students can continue to trickle in, some as late as a half hour. And when I felt that the classroom was full, I then said, if I asked you to stand up before, stand up. And roughly half the students did. And then I said, all right, now if you're sitting down, I want you to find a student that's standing up, and I want you to just say sorry for being late. Now, I wasn't doing this to shame or embarrass the students. I was trying to sort of make sure that I was letting them know that if you're late, sometimes it's okay, but to acknowledge that you're late and apologize. But at the same token, I was probably a little ignorant about my own understanding about their challenges in commuting. And so I paused and I said, we had a conversation about, what it meant to be late and why we were late. And I started asking a question by the show of hands as to how long their commute was. And, City College is largely a commuter campus, so people are traveling at all times. There's issues with the elevator going up and down. Sometimes they're broken. But I would find that most of my students had a commute that was longer than a half hour using the New York City subway system that is not always reliable. Some had commutes that were upwards of an hour and a half. And beyond that, they have to pay to go to school. So that takes $6 each ride, which again, sometimes can be an unnecessary barrier. If you think you're not going to make it on time and you're running a little late and you have to pay $6, is it worth it to still go? And so I was able to sort of better appreciate and understand. And then we were able to have a conversation about like, hey, if you're late, it happens. You know, you don't control the subway system. You know, try to allow for time. If you don't, let us know. Send an email. But you know, also when you come in, you don't need to be embarrassed. Just say, you know, hey, sorry, I'm late, and sit down and join the rest of the class. And so it ended up being something that can be a point of embarrassment or shame, and something that was just more transparent and open in the way in which we treated things. Similarly, I'm sure some of you may have had the experience of a sleeping student in class or someone who's nodding off. As a faculty member, that can be a bit of a blow to the ego, feeling as if your words are not resonating in the way in which you had hoped or liked, which is understandable, right? But what do you do? And so this was an interesting sort of thing I found on Reddit, and I looked at this, and then I looked at the replies. And what was astonishing to me was that most of the replies were, I just let the student sleep, and understand that they may be tired or have experiences or things like that. Which on one hand, I could understand as being potentially compassionate. On the other, I thought, well, that's a missed opportunity for that student to be learning or to understand what's contributing to that lack of sleep, right? And so when I ask students in the morning how they're feeling, and some people say tired, I ask why they're tired. And we talk about how much sleep they get. And, you know, then we talk about the importance of sleep and ways to get it. We talk about the responsibility they have to each other. And since they now know each other's names, you know, I say, hey, if you see someone dozing off next to you, just give them a subtle nudge, you know, because they don't want to be missing something, right? And so again, these kinds of things that can be frustrating as someone who's trying to teach, whether it's someone late or tired, are opportunities to engage and understand the fullness of how someone's showing up in the classroom, to have an open conversation with it, and also give strategies for how students and faculty can better address things that, you know, on one hand can get in the way of learning, on the other hand can be a learning experience in and of themselves. I'm going to play this brief video from Stephanie Land, who I recently interviewed for my podcast, Attribution, which airs on NPR, which talks about people and their journeys in life. And Stephanie Land, if you don't know her, was the author of the book Maid, talking about her experience working as a maid and a mom. And her new book is called Class, which is that same experience, but now trying to do those things while going to college. She's a best-selling author. Her first book has been made into a Netflix series. But in Class, she really talks about this sort of frustration about being someone with limited resources, trying to make do, trying to survive an education process that was not always compassionate, that did not always see her, or the challenge that she did or she was going through. And also what she was herself sort of experiencing in terms of the reticence and the obligation we may expect for students to speak up about their challenges instead of us maybe thinking about how we should consider them. So let's just listen to Stephanie for a minute.
I don't usually like spout off statistics, but one of the ones that I learned recently was 23% of undergraduate students in higher education, like 4-year degree programs, are hungry, like they're food insecure. And so, I mean, that's like 1 in 4, basically.
Yeah.
And that's a pretty high number. And I think it's 8% of grad students consider themselves homeless. And so when you start thinking on those terms, it's not unusual, and it is a shared experience. And so I think just as a university or as a college, like just assume that that's your student population and look at those statistics and think, oh God, well, if 25% of our students are hungry, then we should have a food bank, or, you know, we should have clothing closet. We should have a lending library. We should put some more effort into childcare. Like, and just, I think broadening the spectrum of who you consider to be a student and what that looks like, I think would do a lot for a lot of people.
And this idea of considering who we think a student is and how they're showing up, I think that, you know, sometimes the default, at least from my situation, could be the expectation that students should be showing up ready to learn. And in reality, they often aren't. or maybe there are things they're dealing with that make learning a little bit more challenging. Again, when I talk to students and I've had different experiences where someone says they're hungry. And then in one situation, someone, gave them a balance bar to eat. In another situation, I learned that two of my students were hungry because they were fasting for religious reasons. And so there are reasons why people show up the way they show up. And to the extent to which we can better understand them makes us better able to advocate on their behalf, teach in a way that will break through, build trust in the classroom, et cetera. And I think this idea of assuming that students may not be ready to learn or that are maybe challenging might be the better default sort of moving forward.
I don't usually like
Okay.
spec.
When we don't see students and they don't feel comfortable and they don't feel like they're seen, obviously things happen that we can't imagine or don't want to imagine. And this may seem like an extreme, but there's a story behind it. So 20 years ago, my nephew, who was attending 8th grade in Red Line, Pennsylvania, was in the cafeteria at this point where a classmate shot the principal and then shot himself. And obviously it was a tragic moment for that school, for those families, for the principal, for the faculty, for everybody. And at that time, I was getting my master's at the New School here in New York, and it was in media studies. And so as my film project, I decided I would make a film about this experience and try to understand a little bit about what was happening with my nephew at the time, and the role maybe that this shooting had played. And at that point, I spoke to the guidance counselor in this school. And I asked him about, how things were going, if there were any sort of things that led up to this that he could have possibly seen, things that it makes him think about in the context of how he supports students today. And one of the things he said that was very revealing to me was that he noted that, whether it's a guidance counselor or a teacher, that there is a propensity for us to pay attention to two different kinds of students in the classroom. On one hand, we pay attention to students who are engaged, who are thriving, who are excelling, who are eager to learn. And we do that because it is something that reinforces why we love to teach. Who doesn't want a room full of enthusiastic students who are, interested in what we have to say and what we have to teach? And then he said, on the other hand, we're also forced to make sure that we are addressing those students who may be disruptive in the classroom, students who are making it harder for others to learn. And so essentially you have attention being paid at both ends of a spectrum in the context of a classroom. And he said, what that means is that 80% of the students in any given classroom, or 60 to 80, whatever the number may be, are those in the middle who are not getting a tremendous amount of attention, who are feeling unseen and unheard. And that is a real challenge in terms of how do you create a classroom environment where everyone feels like they belong, everyone feels comfortable, everyone feels equal, and everyone feels seen, and that we're able to connect with each and every student. Now, there was an interesting best practice just go back for a second. This idea of sharing, right? So I mentioned earlier that in my own sort of practice, I try to share a lot about myself and my day as a means to help student open up. And for students, that may take a long time. Some students are more introverted than others. Some aren't as confident. Some may just have reasons why they don't feel as comfortable sort of speaking up. I think it's interesting, by the way, if you look at this Webster's dictionary of the word share and how it is prioritizing the different kinds of sharing. This idea of posting something on a social media platform is higher up the pecking order of definitions of sharing than at the bottom where you say to tell thoughts, feelings, experiences to others. This is what we want to happen in a classroom that we want to share. And so how do we create that environment? How do we connect better with students so they can feel as if they can show up with the fullness of their lived experience? I heard a practice recently at a school. I believe it was out west, where at some point, maybe in the first marking period, they had gathered in the gymnasium, all the students, sorry, not all the students, all the faculty members, and they saw on a wall was this room full of Post-it notes. And on the Post-it note was the name of every single child in that school. And then faculty were instructed to go up and write their name on a Post-it note that they had a direct connection with, that they had a meaningful relationship with, that they knew who they were and how they were doing. And then at the end, they took a step back and looked at all of the Post-it notes where not a single faculty member's name had been written. And I wonder that in the context, for example, on a campus like Penn State, like how many students can move through classes and hallways and feel as if they don't have many connections with faculty members or other students, that there is no building of social capital, and what that means in terms of the long-term sort of prospects for them. Now, the school that I teach in at City College is called the Colin Powell School of Civic and Global Leadership. And what's interesting in terms of this idea of sharing and being seen is that Colin Powell himself was, a son of an immigrant family from Jamaica, that City College was his only choice. He was first generation. He went off and had a very successful career, obviously, in the military and then in politics. And he came back to the college and he immediately recognized this idea that when he heard the stories of the students there, he was so moved almost to the point of tears, because he said, that was me 50 years ago. And in the college today, there is this wall, which has a timeline of who he was and what he accomplished and where he did, and what he did while he was there and what he did when he was gone. And after, interestingly enough, I had spoken to the students early in the semester, and most of them didn't know who Colin Powell was. And so at some point in the semester, we walked down and we walked through his timeline, and were able to point out how many things that they had that were in common with him and his experience, and how there were things that in his journey, in terms of his application for fellowships, his choice to serve, even random sort of acts of luck in terms of how he met his wife or friend groups, that these were the things that propelled him forward. And it serves as a roadmap for the kinds of things that they potentially want to invest in as well. Now, I'm sure we have all heard the term imposter syndrome. It's one that I have felt directly most of my life. Upon graduating from Penn State and going to New York, in the big city, and seeing people who had completely different sort of life experiences than I had, and I'm showing up in a Sears suit and it's really slick, great Capezio shoes. I think I probably was sporting a mullet at the time. It was very clear that, again, I didn't feel like I fit in there. And I felt a little bit like an imposter. And sometimes you feel that way and you feel compelled to fake it. And recently I was reading students' papers and I saw, it was their first essay was a personal essay that they had to write about their own experience. And it was very moving, and it was obviously in their voice. And the second essay was something about different factors that we think about in terms of the psychology of moving up. And as I was reading these essays, it was very clear it didn't feel like it was their voice, right? They weren't plagiarizing, but they were trying to sound different than they were. They were, looking up things in dictionaries and using words and terms, and they were just not in the way in which I was hoping that they would do, internalizing the material that we'd done. Instead, they were trying to sort of be something. And so the next day in class, I played this video. American Idol showing up in a classroom probably doesn't sound particularly relevant. But this was the story about a young man, not too much older than my students, who showed up to support a friend for their audition, and then was given the opportunity to audition himself, and actually was given a golden ticket to go to Hollywood to the next round, and he was really excited. But then he wrote this song about his experience, and his feeling like an imposter. I'm just going to play a little bit of that right now.
All right. Do you?
Yeah.
I'm Keiko. I love storytelling, and today I'm going to tell you a story of mine. I actually wrote it about the audition that I had, and it's about my imposter syndrome, honestly, even being here.
Oh my gosh, you're the accident.
I'm the accident. That's me. Yeah. I think I'm chemically imbalanced. I think I overthink everything, trying not to waste my talents. Think I write great songs, no one hears them all. Am I the best undiscovered actor, just delusional? It's a wonderful life. So what's wrong with me?
Oh.
What if I don't deserve it? What if I never find real love? What if I'm always searching, but the problem was me all along? What if I not inspired to write another song? What if I bet my life, realize I was wrong? What if I'm not special, just one of 7 billion chasing love? What if I'm not enough? Oh, 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 ah. What if I'm not enough? Oh, oh, oh. My brain is like Pandora's box of intrusive thoughts. Wish I could call my mind, have it all, but I can't make it stop. Someone make it stop. What if I'm not enough? Oh man.
So when I played that in class, and the purpose for doing so is I pointed out that, obviously there are points in that song, if you were technically sort of evaluating his performance, where his voice wasn't perfect, his pitch was off, he was breaking up a little bit, but it was authentic and it was real and it was who he was. And I think it's so critical that students feel comfortable not trying to perform to a role of a good student, but to show up as they are. As we know from our experience working with first-gen students or students who come from lesser means, to be in that classroom itself is an exceptional experience, and they are exceptional people for having gotten to that point. And sometimes I think we can lose sight of that. And yes, do we want them to become better writers? Do we want them to improve certain skills? Of course we do. But I don't think that we want them to lose and assimilate to the point where they're not themselves. And I think I see that sometimes when I see papers that show that someone is trying to regurgitate material rather than demonstrate command of it, or to have internalized the concept as something that's relevant to their life and their world. Now, the importance of connection and feeling like you're being seen manifests itself not just in the classroom, but also, I think, after it. We talk a lot in my class about the importance of social capital. It's part of the reason why I make sure that they know each other's names, because these are the people who, as they move forward in their career, they may have opportunities to connect with or advance with, or find opportunities to collaborate. Recently, I got a note from a student who I taught several years ago, and the first line, "I don't know if you remember me." I mean, again, going back to the video from American Idol we just saw, we heard, Luke Bryan says, "I don't remember him." Of course, it's not going to be possible for us to remember every student who walks through our class, right? But to have a means by which they feel comfortable that they can reach out to us and ask for counsel after they're gone, something that's particularly hard for first-generation students or children from lesser means, where they don't have the built-in social connections or social network that is so important moving forward. And to create an environment where they can feel comfortable doing that, I think, is critical. Now, I want to sort of just take a moment to sort of flip things on its ear a little bit. We're talking a lot about first-generation students, people who traditionally don't have a lot of means or often don't. But there are students who have plenty of means and show up in a classroom, and they should be felt to be comfortable. This was a headline from a quiz I had created with support from the Ford Foundation years ago. And when I was talking about, it's a quiz that asks you to reflect on 13 questions from your life that will give you your American Dream score and show you the kinds of things that have been working for and against you. And at some point, the reporter asked if this was a privilege calculator. And I said, it is definitely not. because it's not about privilege, it's about asking people about their lives. And sometimes we talk too much about privilege. We can make people feel guilty for things that they don't control. I'm sure some of you are probably familiar with things like privilege walks, where we ask students to take steps forward based off of things that they have that are advantageous. I think that can be stigmatizing, both for the people who feel left behind and the people who are felt to move forward. There's a way to create an environment in a classroom where people feel seen and heard, regardless of the conditions in which they're showing up, largely beyond their control. The last thing I want to sort of touch upon is the question of grades. I don't know how many of you have seen this study coming out of Yale, where basically they showed that 80% of all grades that were given were A's. Some of us may have felt or experienced some grade inflation during COVID, but this pandemic error bump, they shows, has persisted, right? And so this idea of 80% of grades being given an A. And I talk to my students and I'm like, do we think that that means that they're all smarter and are earning the A's, or is the possibility that there are other things that are happening there? And I talk a lot with my students about grades and how they show up, acknowledging that some people are showing up with different degrees of experience in writing and speaking and fundamental skills that are going to influence their ability to perform in that class. And I am a big believer in de-emphasizing grades because I think it both perpetuates focusing on the wrong outcome and also is a limiting factor in terms of the way in which they're able to achieve their college experience. With many first-generation students, there's such a feeling of guilt and burden at having to perform well, at having to get certain grades to make their families proud, that in turns it means that they don't take advantage of other opportunities on campus, clubs, social engagements, other things that could be critical moments and parts of their college experience. Now, where I do sort of think about grades is in the context of myself. And so I surprised my students earlier this semester with a pop quiz where I wanted to know how I was doing and how I graded out in this class. I wanted to know how they rated it. I wanted to know how relevant it was to their life. I wanted to understand what was valuable about the kinds of things that we were doing in class. I wanted to know if there's things we should change that would make it better from them. And you see at the bottom, it's a bonus question. I wanted them to list the names of as many of their classmates as possible. Again, sort of reinforcing this need for social capital. This was designed to sort of make sure that they understood in the context of a classroom that while I may be standing in the front of the class, they, I believe, are the ones who should have the power. They're paying for their education. They're showing up. They're doing the work. And I wanted to make sure that they understood that I was accountable to them. And then after they took the quiz, we had a conversation about it because I wanted to understand, I wanted them to sort of see if they knew why I was doing this. And they did. They're like, yeah, you want us to sort of, you want to do what's right for us and you want to build trust. And I think this was a very effective tool for doing both of those things. So I began at the beginning of this with the opening sort of spread from my children's book. And this is the last spread. Each day I feel more at home. Each day my dream becomes more real. I think we all dream of being seen, of feeling that we belong, that we're allowed to show up exactly as we are and who we are, and not have to conform or perform for others. And I think as faculty members, this has been a humbling sort of journey for me in terms of experiencing, really trying to see students for who they are, trying to be vulnerable and share to create an environment where they can feel comfortable doing the same, and to always remember that it is me that is accountable to them, not the other way around. Thank you all for listening. I think we've got a couple minutes for questions, and we'll open it up there.
Thank you so much, Bob. That was really wonderful. We do have a Q&A section and a chat section in Whova. If you have questions, if you could please pose them there, and we will both see them. So there was a comment earlier, Bob, when you talked about the I think it was a Reddit post, I can't remember, about this, what do
Yeah.
you do if the student sleeps in class?
Yeah.
And Emily had responded to that she wondered if we'd get different responses on that issue from college professors versus K through 12 teachers, and what might be some of the reasons behind that.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, when I was looking at the handful of comments that were there, it seemed as if it sort of ran the gamut. In fact, it seemed like it skewed towards older students, whether they were late in high school or in college. I don't know. I mean, it's funny now that I go back and I'm in elementary school sometimes doing sort of readings and such. I just see that there is, for fairly obvious reasons, a lot of like compassion is built into the sort of the process, right? And your response, you're with the same kids all day, all year. And so the relationships and the trust form. And in college, when we were seeing students maybe, just for an hour, a couple hours a week, and they're in and out of our lives in a semester, depending upon, what their major is or what we're teaching, I think it's easier to maybe not see them, or not take the time to, like, if someone's sleeping, like, it might be a natural, well, it's their loss, like they're responsible for their education, right? But sometimes I think that, I've really learned a lot about, what it takes for a child or a student to show up in that class. Like, they may be working 35 hours a week, and, or they may be supporting family members. They may be, providing a lot of help and support for, or caregiving in their home. I mean, the statistics of the number of students in college now that are single parents, I think is upwards of 20%. I mean, which is crazy to think about, and things that we probably wouldn't be aware of if we didn't sort of ask or know or get to sort of understand the challenges that students may face.
Yeah, absolutely. I was really struck by when you talked about not making assumptions about, the causes of students' behavior or the causes of students, whatever they're doing. And I think that's just a really important thing that in my journey as an educator, it took me a little while to learn that too, but I think that's just a really important lesson to take away from your classroom. And oftentimes, I know for me, it was kind of a painful experience to realize I was making incorrect assumptions about students' behavior, and that there were very real reasons why they weren't showing up in the ways I expected them to. So
Yeah, and sometimes it's well intentioned. I had made the mistake where I misgendered someone at a couple of years ago, and I knew it immediately after I did it, and I apologized. And then I called the student up to see me after class because I wanted to apologize again, and they told me that actually that made it worse, because now I was singling them out after the class as well, right? And so the next time that happened again a couple of years later, and this time I didn't do that, and I reached out via email and explained the entirety of the situation, including my previous experience, and they were just really understanding and very like, hey, appreciate how you're handling this. I think that it's a real learning journey for faculty members. We go through this, and that's why I think the reason why I check in every single day with how they're feeling, and it takes up, probably like 15 minutes of classroom, but I think that's a valuable 15 minutes to figure out, like, where is everybody right now? And I learn things about, how many other tests they have, or how many, where they are in terms of their workload. And sometimes I'll adjust based on what's due for me. I'll be more flexible. Just a variety of ways in which we can try to be more accommodating and understanding.
yeah. Well, thank you so much, Bob. This has been really wonderful. I'm looking forward to your new children's book. When's it going to be out?
It comes out June 6th of this year.
That's exciting.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your experiences with us and your wisdom. And we really are glad to have had you here today. Sorry about the tech difficulties, but I think we got your whole presentation taped so people can go back for the next 3 months in Whova and watch it if they didn't get a chance to. If you are in attendance today, you're going to get a survey or an email asking you to rate the session in Whova. We'd appreciate it if you could do that, and hope that you enjoy the rest of your day here at the First Gen Summit. Thanks once again, Bob. We really appreciate your time today.
My pleasure. And if anyone has any questions, feel free to connect afterwards. And thank you for taking the time to attend. I know there's a lot of really valuable sessions to choose from. So thanks for coming out today.